So let's get back to some of your core ideas that you developed in that blog.
Sure.
As I read it, okay. So there's a vigorous critique of democracy. I mean, that's sort of in a way where it starts, or maybe that's the foundation of it. Is that?
Well, I can tell you. Are you a libertarian, Thad? Are you now, or have you ever been a libertarian?
So insulting. Why would you even insinuate?
It's just a question, Leon.
No,
Uh,
I hang out with a lot of them.
yeah.
I
Sure.
like a lot of libertarian ideas. My ideas have a lot of overlap with theirs. On public policy, I generally agree with them, but there's a lot more to life than public policy.
I
And
don't
that's,
believe in public policy at all, but
I know, yeah,
but yeah, no, you're familiar with libertarian ideas. So I mean,
yes, yes,
before I kind of went off the rails here, um, I basically, quit my job in 2002 to live off some, ill-gotten gains from the ill-gotten gains from the .com, bubble, and write in kind of independent, PhD thesis in computer science, as I might have, described it back then. And then I also started like reading books and shit. And so I read basically all of Rothbard and Mises. And Rothbard is a wonderful writer. Mises is a genius. Do not read Hayek. There's nothing in Hayek that is not in Mises. Mises is much better. And you shouldn't get, if you think about any situation in which you're basically getting the sort of names and priorities of the people you admire from people who don't admire those people, you kind of have to do the work for yourself. So, Mises is, Hayek's a student of Mises, right? So Mises is amazing. So I read all that. And then, started reading, it's this gentleman who is a student of Rothbard's, who is, of course, Hans Hermann Hoppe.
yes.
So you've read Hoppe, of course. And, I read this material, and, it's funny, I sort of been tending in this direction, and, but at first, you sort of read this and you don't really accept it. Hoppe is like, well, the real libertarianism is actually monarchism. And when I say monarchism, I mean absolute monarchism, motherfucker. And so this was a very metal argument, coming from this very, I don't know if have you met Hoppe,
No, I've heard
I really would love to go to his Turkish retreat one of these years. Maybe I can manage that.
metal argument.
So Hoppe's great, but at first you sort of, you're like, okay, this is kind of a rhetorical statement about libertarianism, that basically absolute monarchy is the real libertarianism. Then that sort of gives you kind of the grounding that you need to connect your own perspective to these kinds of pre-modern writers. And then you can start reading the pre-moderns basically for themselves. And that, is sort of a kind of a door out of this very, very narrow Plato's cave of kind of modern thought about, government that we live in. So I really blame Hoppe. That's sort of where I jumped off. And, at that point you start reconsidering a lot of, very basic assumptions about, this Anglo-American system of government, which of course is the best in the world in history and all that shit.
Yeah. So, okay. So give us, for those who don't know, what is the classical libertarian critique of democracy? As you read it.
Well, okay. Going back to the classical, critique of libertarian, I guess what you would get even in a Rothbard, what Rothbard would say is that, the support of the people or the support of a majority or whatever does not change the character of a government. It does not change the character of its actions. It is, what it does. Of course, these systems can be, very, very tyrannous in many ways. I don't know that that's the most sort of basic or fundamental critique of, here you have this word democracy that's, at least as complicated as racism. It's one of these words where if you sort of accept it as a symbol and you refuse to deconstruct it, you can find yourself going around in a lot of circles, pretty darn fast. But the basic, sort of social contract Lockean idea of, or even the Rousseauian idea of kind of here's the will of the people. Obviously those guys, don't even believe in that. Then with, with Hoppe, you're going to, you know, more back to the thinking of someone like, Pope's famous, couplet, for forms of government, let fools contest, whichever governs best is best. And whichever governs best is it seems like a very innocuous, almost a tautology, but it's deeply foreign to the entire American political and constitutional tradition.
Wow.
In this really gnarly way. So, basically, if you accept the implications of that, you're basically like, wait a second, this whole tradition that I'm living in is a sort of bubble from this very brief period of time. And the way I think about it, way I think about the historiography of our period is basically I privilege, if I can use the lingo for a second, I privilege, perspectives from, within this bubble, much more greatly over, these subaltern perspectives from outside the bubble. And yet these subaltern works I can find anywhere. I can go on Google. They're actually easier to get than works from inside the bubble. And, then once I read these subaltern works, I start thinking these forbidden questions about the other, like, what would the other think of us? What would the Victorians think of 2020? Would they disagree according to their Victorian Whig and Tory party lines, or would they be all like, nah, yeah, okay, pretty clear what we're looking at here, and so, once you basically start asking those kinds of questions, and you say, hey, there's this great line, the historian Ranke, this great line of Ranke, which is every era is equal in the eyes of God. Now not being a religious person or anything, but it's a good line. And, basically what that tells you is that the Victorian perception of 2020 is just as valid as 2020's perception of the Victorians, except that they can't do the talking, so we have to read their books and speak for them. And that's obviously a very different mission of kind of studying the past than what you're used to, but that's certainly what I believe in.
All right, so unpack this thing about the real libertarianism is monarchism. How is
the real libertarianism is monarchism? So what you see, I think, in a lot of political philosophies is you see that they have this kind of Newtonian quality where they work well. They make sense sort of within a specific regime, and they fall over outside that regime. So Newtonian physics works really, really well unless you're going like 150,000 miles, per hour, and then at that point it starts to yield like really questionable results, right? And you're just like, this is just wrong, right? So, when I think about, the ideas behind sort of libertarianism and the desirability of essentially passive action, and the passive order, you can find those ideas in Lao Tzu. You can find those ideas basically all across history. You can find them in the Stoics. It's basically the idea that kind of, here's this thing that should rest on its own weight, and the less force, the king, Lao Tzu is like, the king should be the unmoving point that everything moves around. So if you take, I don't have a pencil handy, but if you take a pencil and you stand it on its point, basically you've got a very, you've essentially got an unstable equilibrium like that. Where the pencil, the need for government never quite goes away, even though the government that governs less is best. Right. So moreover, the farther your pencil gets from top dead center, imagine now your pencil is the size of a telephone pole, right? The farther your pencil, you can actually hold that steady with your hand. If you're at the top of it, you could hold a telephone pole with a pencil point on it. But if you let it fall over, you're going to need some heavy equipment to pick it back up. Yeah. And so you have this regime that basically says that, sort of presents this ideal of sovereignty, and where this ideal of sovereignty comes from is basically, okay, yes, this is true under normal circumstances, maybe a little less true if you have like a global pandemic or something crazy like that. And it's basically not true under emergency circumstances, and it doesn't create itself and it doesn't maintain itself. So that's why basically when you try to, libertarians really think they have the solution to, who will watch the Watchmen, right? And they're like, we don't need any watchmen. It's completely automatic. We just flip a switch. Very, very technology, very industrial revolution, right? And, you know, you can see why this appealed to, you know, sort of man in the age of machinery, that the idea that you could build the system without any sort of, that would just run by itself. But of course, when we actually, it doesn't seem to really work like that. And so you basically say, well, if you can't dispense with power, how should power actually work? And you basically get outside the libertarian regime, and then you're like, oh, the libertarian regime is just a special case of this when shit is going really well and it isn't fucked up and everything is working fine.
Right.
But that's not how you get to that envelope. And you don't get the telephone pole lifted up by taking your hand off it. And, you know, it was that point that I became no longer a libertarian.